Armand, we are very honored to have you in our midst. We appreciate very much how you've assisted us in our programming here at the university over the last several years, but we're especially honored to have you here at ISS today. So the floor is yours.
You're very kind and gracious. I appreciate it very much. I was thinking about my connection with CGU and realized that they go back quite a way, actually. My first connection was a request that I received from two former students at CGU. These were Sarah Patterson and Faye Botham, who were putting together a program for a Bradshaw conference. And so this was in the fall of 2003. So we're, almost 10 years. And they requested me to make a presentation at the 2004 Bradshaw conference, which I did in February of that year. So that was my first presentation at CGU. And then later in 2004, I was invited to join the LDS Council on Mormon Studies, which is the advisory group that helps Patrick in the Howard W. Hunter Chair, both in fundraising and in various kinds of other social and moral support. So that started in 2004. I've been doing that ever since. And before the Howard W. Hunter Chair was endowed and Richard Bushman came, I taught the only courses in Mormon studies, one a year for 4 or 5 years. And so I've got that connection. I've helped out on some thesis and dissertation committees, one of which was that for Lon Huntsman, whose dissertation dealt with a comparison between St. Paul and Joseph Smith in their efforts to use scriptural discourse in the quest for power and influence over their followers. So, having attended some of these events myself also, I think I have a fairly good understanding of what ISS is all about, what you're trying to accomplish, and so I thought I would try to choose something that would be in line with that thrust and that mission. As one of the brochures says in ISS, the interest is in scriptures and the work that we make them do for us, in the uses of scripture, therefore. And mainly with the issue of the acquisition and maintenance of power and influence. But as I thought about it, I recognized that it's not only scriptures per se that have such uses and can be made to do that kind of work. But the same is true of many religious biographies, particularly founder biographies. So as I thought about that, it occurred to me that from my knowledge not only of Joseph Smith, but some of the other founders of American religions, like Ellen White, Mary Baker Eddy, Charles Taze Russell, all of them have biographies, maybe autobiographies, maybe biographies written by others, that also have uses of kinds that are similar to the uses that can be made of scriptures. And this was particularly interesting in the case of Joseph Smith, because he not only became very quickly the object of biographical writing, but he was the author of new scriptures. And so I'm interested mainly, however, in the scripture-like uses of biographies of Joseph Smith rather than in the scriptures that he authored, and because those can be the subject for another time. Not all biographies, of course, have this function or can be used in that way, but there's a process that we might call scripturalization that goes on with especially founder biographies. By scripturalization, I mean a process by which these biographies are imbued with sacredness, such that they are not open to question. In a kind of pedestrian as opposed to academic definition of the sacred is that it's not open to question. And so that's kind of what I mean by it. And this happens not only with denominational religion, but as some of you, I'm sure, have come across in your reading the notion of the American civil religion and the scriptures of the American civil religion, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the hymn, which is the national anthem. All these things also possess a kind of sacredness with which they've been imbued by the nation, and not only just by the leaders. The writings of and about religion founders are particularly susceptible to this scripturalization process when the founding narrative includes truth claims that are fundamental to the religion. So, for example, especially with the Abrahamic religions, you have Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, and to this list we will add Joseph Smith, for all of whom there were autobiographies and biographies written, although authorship is not too clear in some of those ancient cases, yet those biographies are there and are sacralized by virtue or scripturalized by virtue of the fact that they not only tell the story of the founder, but that they include events that are fundamental to the truth claims of the religion. So, for example, you can have a biography of Jesus, maybe that would have been written by Thomas Jefferson, but wouldn't have much to say about his resurrection. But surely, to the believer, the question of the resurrection is not just a truth claim, but an inherent part of the story of the life and mission of Jesus. And you could make the same claim about much that's in the Quran, about Muhammad. You could certainly make the same claim about Moses, although it's less clear who wrote a lot of the scriptures attributed to Moses. Where Joseph Smith is concerned, the scripturalization process began nearly at the beginning. Interestingly, young Joseph Smith himself was not a very frequent writer. He did not write a lot with his own pen, but he dictated a lot to other people. He did some writing of his own, but most of what is written about Joseph Smith and attributed to him was written by other people at his behest. And one of the earliest things that he wrote, which is both an important part of his biography and is a highly scripturalized text, is something called The Writings of Joseph Smith. And this is about a dozen pages long, small print, thin paper that's included in a Mormon book of scripture called The Pearl of Great Price. In this, Joseph Smith gives an account of all of the miraculous experiences that happened to him that eventually led him to establish the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and to translate and promulgate to the world a book of scripture called the Book of Mormon. Now you could read that simply as a piece of biographical work, but it is inherently also sacralized and scripturalized by the truth claims that are in there. And interestingly, the official version of that is in the book of Scripture called The Pearl of Great Price was not written by Joseph Smith. Bits and pieces might have been. Almost all of it is a committee product, actually put together by church leaders in Salt Lake City after Brigham Young was heading the church. But it's the official account. And that's why I speak of it as scripturalized, because it is the official account that the church puts out. Now, it has also then become a contentious document, first of all among those who rejected Joseph Smith's claims, but even in more recent times, in the 21st century, people are still responding to that scripture by Joseph Smith in ways that make it problematic and contentious. Anyway, the main point of all this is to suggest that a scripturalization process can apply to biographies, and that founder biographies are especially susceptible to this scripturalization process. Now, and can therefore be used in all the ways that ISS talks about scriptures being used, making them do certain kinds of work and giving them certain uses. And what kinds of uses are these? What kinds of work would this be? Well, it would be work in the interests of the writer or in the interest of even a reader. So it's fair to ask with a biography, just as it is with a book of scripture, whose interests are served by the promulgation of this document, especially its promulgation as scripture or even quasi-scripture. So that's kind of behind my thinking. Now, all of this to a sociologist is reminiscent of a more fundamental idea in sociology that goes back at least to the phenomenology of people like Alfred Schutz in philosophy, but particularly to the work of Peter Berger or Berger and Luckman in their book called The Social Construction of Reality. For that is what we are doing, either with scripture or with biography, when we impose on that scripture or biography a master narrative of some kind. This master narrative then becomes a certain construction of reality, and that master narrative guides the development and eventually the outcome and conclusions of whoever the author is who's writing it. And this has certainly been true with the biographies of Joseph Smith, that different authors have had different master narratives that they have used to develop that biography. I'll turn to some examples of those in just a moment. But I think it's important to establish at this stage that once a certain construction of reality is embedded in a master narrative, whether it's officially scripture or is quasi-scriptural biography, once that master narrative is embedded, it expresses a given ontology, definition of reality, and that from an academic point of view, from a scholarly point of view, no ontology is privileged at the outset over any other ontology. So we all start out even. And therefore, when someone writes a biography, say, of Joseph Smith that is critical and uses a certain master narrative to explain what he was all about, why, that's based on one ontology. But an apologist and believer does the same thing with a different ontology. So we have a couple of different ontologies, neither of which is a priori privileged. So one of the things that's always a question is, when you're doing hermeneutics of any kind, either about a scripture or in interpreting the life of a founder, you always have the question of what ontology is being favored over what other possible ontologies. I don't know if how many of you have a sense for where Mormonism came from, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as it's appropriately and long-windedly called. But it comes out of the early 19th century period of the Second Great Awakening. It has roots in common with other denominations that emphasized primitivism, religious, scriptural New Testament primitivism, and the notion of restorationism. It was close in particular to the Campbellite movement and its restorationist origins. And Joseph Smith kind of added to the restorationist claims a couple of others. One was that God was actually opening the heavens and speaking to living prophets again, which the religious establishment for centuries had said was all over with. And second of all, Joseph Smith produced a rather astonishing 500-page book of new scripture called the Book of Mormon, that he attributed to divine revelation. And then finally, something that made his claims different from others out of this same context was his claim that any religious organization, new church or the like, in order to be authorized to operate in the name of God, needed to have the apostolic priesthood that the New Testament says that Jesus gave to his apostles. And the Joseph Smith's claim was that apostolic priesthood had been lost centuries ago through corruption of the church and needed to be restored. And his claim was that through him that priesthood had been restored. And in that sense, the Mormons are more like Catholics than like Protestants, because they insist on the importance of an apostolic priesthood. Now, as soon as Joseph Smith's biography began to emerge, even while he was still back in the upstate New York, where this all started, that biography was very much in contention, and a number of his associates or former associates wrote rebuttals to that biography, and so since that time, from the early 19th century to the middle of the 20th century at least, all of the biographies of Joseph Smith could be evaluated as either pro or con. There weren't any in between. You had some really anti-Mormon biographies, as well as the Mormon apologetics. And then since that time, since about the middle of the 20th century, a new kind of scholarship has developed quite gradually and slowly, which has kind of filled in the continuum between strictly apologetic and strictly anti. And I'd like to just give you some examples of those. First, I'd like to read a brief quotation from an article by D. Michael Quinn. I don't know if you and how many of you have met Mike Quinn, but he comes here from time to time. Have you ever met him?
No, I don't think so.
Well, he's a scholar of Mormon background who has had a somewhat contentious relationship with the church, but is describes himself fundamentally as a believer, but one who has a really comprehensive conception of the life of Joseph Smith. And he writes of the life of Joseph Smith as follows: a man who was a youthful mystic, a treasure seeker and a seer, a visionary who spoke modern revelations and communicated ancient ones anew, a loving husband who deceived his wife regarding polygamous proposals, marriages, and cohabitations, a man for whom friendship and loyalty meant everything, but who provoked disaffection by testing the loyalty of his most devoted associates, an anti-Mason who became a master Mason, a church president who physically assaulted both Mormons and non-Mormons for insulting him, a devoted father who loved to care for his children and for those of others, a temperance leader and a social drinker, a Bible revisionist and esoteric philosopher, a pacifist and a commander-in-chief, a student of Hebrew and Egyptology, an indigent and a bank president, a friend of American Indians and the occupier of lands that he regarded as rightfully theirs, a jail escapee, a healer, a city planner and land speculator, a mayor, a judge, and a fugitive from justice, an absolute heterosexual who enjoyed snuggling in bed with male friends, a guarantor of religious freedom, but a limiter of freedom of press and speech, a preacher and a street wrestler, a polygamist and an advocate of women's rights, a husband of other men's wives, a declared bankrupt who was the trustee and trust of church finances, a political horse trader and U.S. presidential candidate, election of 1844, an abolitionist who authorized the ordination of already free African Americans, but respected the rights of slave owners, a theocratic king, an inciter to riot, an unwilling martyr. In the record, Joseph Smith is all of those things. So how do you write a biography of such a person, and especially one that would be given the kind of sacred aura that you would expect with a scripturalization process? Well, I find there are basically these four categories. There are the apologetics, of course, and these include, of course, potentially any and all official church literature or literature written by employees of the church. Perhaps the most important of these, though, is the history of Joseph Smith by his mother, first produced in 1845. Now, you know, having your mother write your biography can't be all bad. And this is a really valuable for its source material about the creation of this new religion. Interestingly enough, it became a source of contention to Joseph Smith's successor as head, Brigham Young, because when Joseph Smith was assassinated, which occurred in Nauvoo, Illinois, in 1844, there was a long, drawn-out process. At least it lasted several weeks in choosing a successor, because Joseph Smith had not really left very clear arrangements behind for his successor. Eventually, out of an essentially political process, Brigham Young emerged with the best claim to be his successor, and took most of of the Mormons off to Utah. However, Joseph Smith's family didn't go. They stayed in Nauvoo, Illinois. His wife and his sons and his mother, they all stayed there. And to make a long story short, eventually became the nucleus for the organization of a competing church called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. One of the followers of Brigham Young, who really admired the biography that the mother had written, Lucy Mack Smith's biography, got it published on his own initiative while he was away on a mission for the church in England. And Brigham Young was very unhappy about the publication of the mother's biography because, again, if we talk about biography as we talk about scripture, whose interests are being served, you know, by a particular biography. Well, Lucy Mack's interest was in portraying the development of this new religion as the product of the Smith family. It was a Smith family enterprise. It wasn't just Joseph. And it certainly wasn't his successor, Brigham Young, who in the minds of the immediate family, the Smith family, had some weakness in his claims to be a successor. So while this is a very important source document, as I say, it must be read with the understanding that for Lucy Mack it was a document to create the narrative as the master narrative that this was a Smith family enterprise from the beginning. I won't mention any of the other apologetic works that have been written, but there are many of them. Francis Gibbons and Susan Easton Black, Milton Bachman, Hiram Andrus, Preston Nibley, John Widsoe, Heidi Swinton, a lot of them. Now, the second category is what I would call not out-and-out apologetics, but interpretations by believers. These believers are people who still want to portray their understanding of the life of Joseph Smith as a respectable scholarly product. So they work very hard to try to get balance. And while they will admit, usually up front, that they are believers, they try to write in such a way that their belief is not really apparent to the reader. And it doesn't really, in some sense, undermine the scholarly nature of their work. Now, one of these was written very early in 1933 by John Henry Evans, called Joseph Smith, an American Prophet. And in 1977, Donna Hill wrote Joseph Smith, the First Mormon, published by, I should say John Henry Evans was published by Macmillan, so this wasn't a church press. Donna Hill in 1977 wrote Joseph Smith, the First Mormon, published by Doubleday, again a respectable publisher. But the one that's probably best known to all of you is the one by our colleague Richard Bushman, called Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling, written in 2005, and it had been preceded by a smaller and earlier book that dealt only with the first part of his life. But the 2005 biography covered his entire life up to his death in 1844. So Rough Stone Rolling, published by Knopf in 2005, has been really acclaimed and by all people of all kinds, both pro and con. And what Richard Bushman tries to do in this, while admitting that he himself is a believer, what he tries to do in Rough Stone Rolling is portray Joseph Smith, one might say his master narrative, is to portray Joseph Smith as one who came out of this cultural milieu that I described earlier, and including the whole early American cultural milieu, but rose above it. This was Bushman's claim, that Joseph Smith came out of that, but he rose above it. And by which he means he turned things that had been early American culture into new phenomena of a more supernatural importance. For example, it's well known that as a boy, Joseph Smith dabbled in various kinds of magic, and even had certain stones or rocks that he used that he claimed he could use to find buried treasure and things like that. People actually hired him to do that. His career didn't last too long because it didn't do too well. But as he got older, he began to leave behind the assumptions of magic per se, and try instead to communicate directly with the heavens, and to draw on revelatory products that came to him in his mind without the use of any magical instruments. And that's what I mean by the claim that he began as part of that religious milieu, but grew out of it and made something more of it than the simpler form that he had. Bushman's well known for writing a number of books that emphasize, in early American history, that emphasize the importance of cultural influences on individual actors. And he used that framework basically for Joseph Smith. But actually one of Bushman's kind of internal church critics actually criticized him for not carrying that nearly to the extent with Joseph Smith that he had carried it with others that he wrote about in the early 19th century. But on the whole, the critics of Rough Stone Rolling have been very favorable, and naturally Bushman gets a certain amount of criticism for writing as a believer and doing so up front, but he nevertheless has put together a wonderfully comprehensive document, the most thorough one we have on the life of Joseph Smith. You know, one can always ask, in cases of people like these who are believers and do their best to write without betraying their commitments, do their best to write as scholars, one can always ask, well, can we judge their motives, or should we just take their word for the claim that they are doing their best as scholars? And I think that's always going to be a question. I find in my own work about early religious figures that it's difficult to assess motives. I try to avoid assessing motives, and what I try to do instead is see what I can infer from what is written about the interests that are being served. So that's the crucial thing to me, not attributing motives per se, but asking, you know, what interests are being served. The third category of biographies about Joseph Smith I would call critical interpretations. Not critical in the sense that the authors are necessarily hostile toward the subject, but critical in the sense that they are undertaking to use the tools of social science and as scholars to create a master narrative that's maybe different from others that have been tried before and might shed different kind of light on the person's life. And there have been a number of these. I'll mention just a couple of them in passing. Early in the 1830s, one such was written by a critic of Mormonism called Eber D. Howe, Mormonism Unveiled, whose master narrative was to portray Joseph Smith as a front man for Sidney Rigdon, a Campbellite who was the real brains of the church, and to advocate that the Book of Mormon was really plagiarized from somebody named Solomon Spaulding. Both claims that even opponents of Joseph Smith wouldn't hold now, but they seemed to be important at the time. Robert Remini wrote in 2002 Joseph Smith. It was a short biography of the Penguin series. Remini is best known as a Jacksonian scholar of early American history, and so he portrayed Joseph Smith as a product of Jacksonian America and as a kind of Jacksonian hero. I mean, after all, if Jackson proved that anybody could be president, Joseph Smith proved that anybody could be prophet, and maybe even anybody could be God. And so there's nothing more Jacksonian than that, and that's kind of what came across in his work. I'll skip over some others because I see time is running out, but one of the most interesting categories of these critical interpretations are the psychobiographies that have been written. The earliest of which was written by somebody called Woodbridge Riley, who wrote first a master's thesis and then a PhD thesis, in which he portrayed Joseph Smith as an epileptic, and as and the Book of Mormon as a pseudo-biography of Joseph Smith. Then Robert Anderson in 1999 wrote Inside the Mind of Joseph Smith, Psychobiography in the Book of Mormon, in which is a very hostile psychoanalytical account of Joseph Smith's life. He's heavily Freudian. I've never quite understood that. It seems to me that if you can believe Freud, you shouldn't have trouble with Mormon's angel stories. But he's really committed Freudian, and he portrays the Book of Mormon as revealing, as a kind of psychoanalytic study of Joseph Smith and his narcissism, and the Book of Mormon again as a crypto autobiography. William D. Moraine in 1998 has a fairly sympathetic psychobiography of Joseph Smith that portrays him as a kind of product of dysfunctional family and 3 very painful surgeries, all of which, as a child, all of which affected his psyche and led to some of the things he did. Perhaps the most remarkable most remarkable biographical treatment of Joseph Smith is the one by Harold Bloom in his The American Religion, published in 1993, in which he calls Joseph Smith a religious genius, like Mozart was a musical genius, Joseph Smith was a religious genius, in particular because Joseph Smith was able, as Bloom put it, to recover ancient Kabbalistic and Hermetic ideas and traditions from ancient Judaism. And since Bloom is a Kabbalist, among other things, it's not difficult to understand why his master narrative would portray Joseph Smith in this way. And it really does create a kind of puzzle about where Joseph Smith would have gotten these ideas that Harold Bloom attributes to ancient Judaism. But for Bloom, this really proves the fundamental genius of Joseph Smith. Now Bloom, this was in '93, in more recent comments about the Mormon Church, Bloom is not very complimentary. He thinks that the Mormon Church is a far cry from what Joseph Smith had in mind, but it's a fairly remarkable thing. So those are all examples of what I would call critical interpretations of Joseph Smith. Finally, I'll just say a word about apostate bibliographies. That's the fourth category. Now it's very common for religious founders to collect converts, some of whom later on become apostates and leave the church. And this is a kind of whole literature in its own right, apostate literature. It's really very interesting. And what's interesting about apostate literature is a similarity in the master narrative. The master narrative with apostates always has to cover the question of how did I get roped into this crazy movement to start with, and how did I get out? So the apostate works about Joseph Smith all reflect fundamentally that basic narrative, how I got drawn in, and what attracted me about it in the first place, and then finally how I got out. Now that I'm out, I'm saved again, and so I can look back and see all the things that were terrible about it in the past. Now sometimes the motivation for this is hard to avoid, that is selling barn burner books. But often it's not so clear. I mean, the apostates really don't get anything out of it. Perhaps the best example, and also one of the best biographies of Joseph Smith, that is also a wonderful example of apostate literature, is Fawn Brodie's book in 1945. This is, who remembers the name? There we go. No Man Knows My History. And hers is a critical, hers kind of comes in the third category too of critical literature, but it's definitely, you read it, you get clearly, you can see what interests are being served here. It's definitely a psychobiography written to vindicate her apostasy and her break with the church and her own family as a result. And she made the argument, really, that was made later on in the 1980s or 90s by Vogel, Dan Vogel, namely that Joseph Smith was a pious fraud. That is, Joseph Smith came to believe his own claims. And so as his career went along, he actually became sincere and really believed all these things, whereas to begin with, he was trying to perpetrate a fraud. And her book, with its mixture of psychobiography, was very attractive for a long time. It was the biography to read before Bushman came along with a more comprehensive one. So her biography is really difficult to put down. It's really written in a colorful way. Seems to me I was going to say something else about that, but it's slipped away from me. And I see I'm running out of time. So I think I'll just close by emphasizing that as I read biographies of founders, starting with Joseph Smith, I see in that endeavor the need to read and analyze in some of the same ways that ISS teaches us to read and analyze scriptures. And so one can do that with the biographies of Joseph Smith, but let's not forget the point that I made earlier, namely that whatever master narrative you embrace involves embracing a certain ontology that goes with it. And if no ontology is a priori privileged over any other ontology, then your believer's ontology is as good as your critic's ontology. And so we end up having to choose an ontology and choose a master narrative. And that's okay, but it is interesting and perhaps ironically, ultimately an act of faith. Because we end up faith in something, and we can have faith in a certain master narrative as opposed to some other kind as we undertake to understand the lives of important people like Joseph Smith. Thanks for your attention.
All right, thank you. All right, we have a good 10 minutes, so I hope we'll make use of it to have some interaction with Armand. Lots to chew on, so let's jump in. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was curious. So you talk about how reading founders' biographies as if they are scripture can help us understand them, and how, like, at least faithful biographies of Joseph Smith have been come to be read as scripture by Latter-day Saints. Mm-hmm. Do you think the other categories of biography, the critical or the apostate ones, have been used pretty much or essentially as scripture by other groups?
Perhaps. I don't see in those other approaches, though, an attempt at sacralizing it.
Yeah.
You know, in the way that you have believers sacralizing the accounts of Joseph Smith.
Well, I guess what I'm wondering is, do you see other people essentially sacralizing those accounts?
Well, yeah, I think it depends on how strongly you hold to the ontology mm-hmm. on which it's based. If I can see, for example, that a committed Marxist could approach any number of things mm-hmm. with maybe the same fervency that a believer would, a religious believer would.
Okay.
Sure, behind you. Yes. So I was fascinated by your description of kind of scripture by committee with the early or the earliest biography of Joseph Smith, and thinking, kind of continuing with your thoughts on sort of Berger and Berger-Luckman, thinking about scripturalizing, I wonder what type of works happen around the documentation of what goes on in the committee, the church minutes, the church records, the activity, you know, the sacred moments when the committees are working on mm-hmm. coming up with this thing. Sort of how is that seen and perceived and described in kind of LDS lore?
Well, of course, that never comes to the attention of the rank and file mm-hmm. members.
Right.
They just get the product of it. In order to get access to that, you would have to get access to another category of sacred writing, which is the minutes of the meetings of the church leaders, and those are just not accessible.
I mean, it just strikes me that for a group that is so well known and has had such great efforts at historicizing themselves in this period, that would be a moment that would probably yield some interesting insights into this particular process.
No, you're absolutely right, and
objectivizing, you know, I guess you could say that.
No, you're absolutely right, but you know, in my experience, the overwhelming majority of rank and file Mormons have no idea that they think he wrote it. They think he sat down and wrote it.
It's in the first person.
Yeah, it's in the first person. And that's something that in the 19th century people did all the time, not just in the case of Joseph Smith, but a lot of famous people who published autobiographies had them really written by somebody else in the first person, or largely written by somebody else. It wasn't uncommon at all.
But do we know about who was on the committee? Under whose
Yeah, we do. I
or?
can't tell you who, but G.A. Smith,
George A.
not George Albert, the president of the 20th century, but George A. Smith was a cousin. He was the church historian at the time, and I'm sure that Brigham Young was part of it because it was during his lifetime. It happened mainly in the 1850s and 60s.
But by definition, yours and another kind of history of religions, cultural critical perspective, they're all by committee.
Sure.
I mean, by definition, I mean, it wouldn't be a Lone Ranger's product. Could I ask, I just want to push you on this matter again. This is, of course, fascinating, the category you use, biography. But I detect that you're being the careful scholar I think you've always been, as I hear in the few of your works that I've read. But why wouldn't, I mean, a historian of religion would say right away that what we have come to call scriptures, and what we do is sort of play with, it's just the category is just writings, and of course only at another stage does a community invest it with something else. So it's a kind of myth about sort of the value of the writings themselves. So why aren't you willing to say with some of us that, of course, all scriptures actually come out of biographies and quotation marks? That is, they're always, at first, stories about the revered figure. And then, over a period of time, of course, there are more and more layers that are added, and there are competing stories and competing layers, and on it goes. And one could even argue that what we sort of naively call history is actually part of that whole development. That is, there's still books, unfortunately, I mean, stories about great men. We've sort of added, women and others, but of course that's the core of it. But I detect still some reluctance to overlap. Now, is that part? So even if I go with your categories, sort of these types of, if we say,
the four categories of history, the biography that I was talking about,
they all more or less can get folded back into that interest of telling a story about a revered figure. Now, there'd be tweaks here and tweaks there, but it's just very clear to the point that we're still invested in, well, was he married? So, but it all comes out of that. It's always a core story about the figure, right?
Yeah.
That is, and then develops in ever more sophisticated, obfuscating ways.
Well, I don't feel any particular reluctance about accepting that statement. What I should have said, maybe by way of greater clarification, is that these four categories that I used are time-bound. That's the way it looks now. But in the future, some of these accounts are going to acquire scriptural significance in that they will be endowed with a certain, or they might be endowed with a certain sacredness that they don't now have. Just with the passage of time. Within the movement known as Mormonism or Latter-day Saints, there is an increasing proliferation of diversity in the way people think, and particularly with respect to the role that scholarship has in defining the nature of the religion. I could envision a time when one of these critical biographies, as I classify it now, could become scripturalized. And so later on, that very well could happen. So I meant, for what I had to say today, to apply to this point in time.
But of course, the critical ones are, they're invested in a certain kind of engagement with the core kind of story, so they turn around. So, it spawns industries.
Right.
Not only the writing of modern, but obviously exegetical practices of all sorts. So it's fascinating window onto it, and so you help us to think more about what windows are open, what kinds of questions to raise about scriptures as biographies, or in terms of biographies. Okay, quickly, before we move on.
Do Mormons embrace the Bible as well as the Book of Mormon?
Yes.
I've kind of heard that. Okay.
Yes, definitely.
This is the year to think about.
It is,
these sorts of
yeah.
things, right? Yes.
Thanks to King James.
Yes.
Yes.
And Mr. Romney and so forth, yeah.
Well,
King James, too.
Yeah. Translate. Join me in thanking Armand Mauss.